Thank you, and thank you, Cathaoirleach. I suppose my concerns are the same as previous speakers, and I think we have to remember that this has been very painful for survivors. And one of the other issues that I feel very strong about is that our survivors are getting older. And I think that timing is of the utmost here. And that is my big concern, because I think the longer this goes on, the longer it is. And I think the longer it goes on, the harder it is, because you seem to be constantly fighting a battle, and I think it's unfair. So I would say that we need to be very aware of our timing on this. I too have concerns about the 6 months. I think it's unfair, really. And what I feel is like a day or a week or whatever is very hard for a survivor, and I think we have to be very mindful of that. And I would just ask maybe that's something that we do really need to look at. And I know the Minister has explained, and you have explained it there, but when you, like other speakers, we have spoken to survivors, and the heartache that they have gone through, like nothing can repay that. And I think at least, there is quite a good bit of money here now from the government. So I think we have to be mindful of our survivors. The other thing was, I know at one stage it was talked about an interim payment of maybe 10 or 15,000, and I just kind of feel too, maybe that's something again needs to be looked at, because as I said, our survivors are getting on. And the other thing is, of course, enhanced medical cards. To me, that is the most important thing as well that we can do for survivors, and it's so important. And you spoke about counselling, and I welcome that. My other concern is counselling for families, because there has been so many survivors and their families that have been affected by this. The families that are feeling it every day when they are talking to their mother, and it has been very hard too for all of them. So I would ask you just about the recognition for supports and counselling for families. But also another issue is, and I think this was brought up when we speak about the redress scheme, one of the issues that did come up to me as well was that it would be as simple, clear and transparent as possible, and provision for the type of application process would be. I think that's important for survivors too. And the other issue that did come up as well is about liaison with an advocate, with a social worker or an advisor to assist them. So I think that's important, because another area that did come up too, which was when I met with survivors, I'm involved with survivors in my own area, and we need to maybe even look at local level, as in region accessibility and local accessibility. And I think that is something that really also needs to be addressed. Again, look, I think this is so important, and I just feel that there is issues there maybe that we can try and sort. And again, I'm sure if survivors are watching today, this hasn't been easy, and all of us have been really affected by the stories that we have heard. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.
There's a lot of questions there.
There is. We'll do our best
to
get through them.
I know that too.
So maybe starting with the some questions there that related to actually getting the scheme up and running and how it runs. So the timing question, having a scheme that's simple, clear and transparent, and the interim payment. So absolutely, it is the firm intention of the Minister to establish this scheme as quickly as possible, and of course that's dependent on the passage of the legislation, but it is one of the factors behind the IDG recommendation to establish an executive office, so that we can do an awful lot more in parallel than if you were to create an agency with the longer lead-in time that would take, and all the ancillary infrastructure that an agency would need that isn't needed in a government department that can start to leverage existing ICT, existing HR, etc. So the commitment is to do it as quickly as possible, and as you say there, Deputy, as well, the firm commitment, and it was something that came through strongly in the consultation with survivors and stakeholders, and was a key concern of the IDG in its proposals, was that the scheme would be as clear, as transparent, as simple and as user-friendly as possible, so that entitlements would be very clear. So again, the idea of the general approach being one where it would be very clear to applicants that payment was based on length of time, based on residency, And so you would know that if you were a resident, you would have a good degree of certainty in terms of applying to the scheme and qualifying for benefits under the scheme versus having to bring forward a burden of proof. And obviously that's also a much more straightforward and efficient type of scheme to run than one that would require individual engagement on with people having to bring forward evidence and the potential traumatising effect, but also the length of time that process would take. So they are very much reflected in the intention of putting together this general scheme and in the work that the team is undertaking at the moment to try and prepare the infrastructure to deliver the scheme. Now, in terms of an interim payment, because we do appreciate that people are very keen and it's really important that the scheme is opened up as quickly as possible. I think one of the very practical challenges there is that because the scheme itself is already designed to provide one payment that is based as simply as possible on residence, it's not really apparent how we would make an interim payment in any faster way, particularly because we require the same infrastructure to make the payment. So we need the IT system, we need the HR resources in place to make the interim payment in the same way we would need it to make the full payment. And the scale of this, again, is something that is way in excess of any other scheme of its kind that the state has ever administered in terms of the anticipated number of applicants, 34,000 applicants, estimated cost of €800 million. So it's the largest of its kind in the history of the state in terms of the expected number of applicants. We also need a legislative basis for access to records and data sharing. So for those reasons, unfortunately, we just can't see how we can move any faster because we need those core blocks to make any form of payment. But absolutely, we're committed to wanting to do this as quickly as possible in the interests of survivors. You also mentioned advocacy and support for people making applications. Yes. So Action 1, and again, this is one measure that sits within a much broader government response and a suite of measures to respond to the needs and concerns of survivors and to recognise the wrong that was done and the suffering. So Action 1 is the creation of enhanced stakeholder engagement mechanisms. And at the moment we are working on proposals for a new form of advocate model that would really enhance the level of advocacy support that is provided in this space. So that's something we hope to progress alongside progressing this scheme, as well as ensuring that existing mechanisms that are out there can be supported. Then you mentioned the fact that nothing can repay what's happened to people. So maybe just to mention on that point, absolutely, that's something that was very much recognised in the work of the IDG, that it's so sad, but you can't give back, sadly, what was taken away. We can't hope to compensate, and so this scheme, as part of the broader action plan, is an attempt to acknowledge, recognise, make amends for the suffering and the wrong, but absolutely recognising that no money can compensate, and it doesn't attempt to do so. It attempts to recognise and acknowledge. There was one further point you'd mentioned there around counselling for families. So the commitments that have been made and the supports that have been put in place to date for counselling services and prioritised access are for survivors and former residents themselves. There isn't anything specific that's been put in place for families.
You might look at that maybe, or we might talk to the Minister. I think that's very important for families that have that option. You know, for counselling too, because they, you know, it's very hard on all of them.
Yes.
If you might look at that. Yeah.
We can certainly take that away to look at and discuss with the Minister. Thank you.